It was supposed to be just another evening, a quiet, ordinary night. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, don't they? Especially when you least expect it. Rachel Emerson always thought she understood her life, the husband who loved his farm more than anything, the long hours of solitude, the endless silence of the countryside. She'd told herself she could live with it. But beneath the still surface, something was brewing. A dangerous curiosity, something that, once ignited, couldn't be snuffed out. Tonight, though, would be different. Tonight, under the cold moonlight, she would make a choice. One that would lead her to a place she never thought she'd go, a decision that would unravel everything she'd built and shatter the life she thought she knew. Because tonight, she wasn't alone. Not really. The day had just begun to fade into evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the vast stretch of open land. It was a place that felt as if time moved at its own pace, unchanged, untouched. The wind stirred the grass in slow waves, and the silence was almost deafening. Here, on a remote Australian farm, Rachel and her husband, Paul, had built a life. It was the kind of place you came to for peace, for simplicity. No neighbors for miles, just endless fields stretching out as far as the eye could see. The air smelled of earth, the kind of deep, rich scent that only a farm could offer. During the day, the place hummed with the quiet buzz of life, a rooster crowing in the distance, the faint clink of metal tools as Paul worked the fields, the occasional bleat of sheep in the far paddocks. But as night approached, a stillness fell over the land. The creaking of the old farmhouse, settled into the soil, seemed to be the only sound that echoed through the thick darkness. The world outside seemed to hold its breath, and within that silence, Rachel sometimes found herself listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, the line between solitude and isolation had a way of blurring. The kind of isolation that could make your thoughts feel heavier, your sense of reality less certain. It was the perfect place for Rachel and Paul to start fresh. A chance to escape the noise of the world and build something of their own. But there was one thing that had always made Rachel uneasy, the presence of their pet kangaroo, Rusty. He'd been there since the beginning, a part of their lives from the moment they had moved in. Rusty had always been a quiet, gentle creature, slow-moving, docile. He was often found near the barn, standing still, gazing at the farmhouse with an intensity that seemed out of place. At first, Rachel thought it was just her imagination, or maybe the animal was simply curious. But over time, she began to notice how he lingered in the same spot, his eyes fixed on the house as if he were waiting for something. His gaze never wavered, and it made Rachel feel uneasy. He would be there in the early morning hours, when the fog still clung to the ground and the birds hadn't yet begun their chorus. And then, at night, when the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly across the land, he would reappear, his outline barely visible in the dim light, standing motionless, watching. The first few times, she brushed it off, convinced that she was reading too much into it. After all, kangaroos weren't known for their social nature. Maybe it was just a strange quirk of his, some odd habit that didn't make sense to her but meant something entirely different to him. Still, it bothered her. The way he stared. It wasn't just that Rusty had a way of standing there for hours, as if rooted to the ground. It was the times when Rachel would look out from the kitchen window, mid-afternoon, and catch him staring at her from across the yard. His stillness would catch her off guard. There was no movement, no sound, just that piercing gaze fixed in her direction. And as soon as she would turn away, distracted by something else, she'd glance back only to find him gone, as if he had never been there at all. But she knew better. He hadn't moved, he had just vanished into the shadows. That night, the air felt heavier, thicker. Rachel stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when she saw it again, Rusty, standing in his usual spot by the barn. She paused, the knife hovering in midair. Something about the way he stood there, bathed in the pale light of the fading sun, seemed different. The air around him felt strangely still. The wind had died down completely, and the world seemed to hold its breath. She didn't move, just stared at him, watching as he remained perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, eyes locked onto the farmhouse. She shook her head, telling herself it was nothing. It was just a kangaroo, after all. Nothing more. But even as she said that, a chill crept down her spine. She could feel the silence of the evening pressing in around her, almost suffocating. Paul had never mentioned anything unusual about Rusty. He was just a part of the farm, as much a fixture as the barn itself. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. There was an odd energy to the place, something she couldn't place, something that unsettled her every time she looked out at the fields. As the days passed, she tried to ignore the gnawing feeling, telling herself that she was simply being paranoid. But the more she watched Rusty, the more she couldn't escape the sense that something was off. His presence, the way he lingered around the barn, became almost deliberate. It was as if he knew something she didn't. That night, as the wind picked up and the darkness settled across the land, Rachel heard a sound, something faint at first. She froze, listening. It was like the rustling of dry leaves, the scratching of something soft against wood. She turned to look out the window, her eyes immediately searching for the familiar figure of Rusty. There he was, standing by the barn again, but this time he wasn't looking toward the house. No, this time he was facing the barn, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something. Her breath caught in her throat. The air had grown unnaturally cold. Something in the distance seemed to move, but the shadows kept it hidden from her view. The wind picked up once more, the grass swaying under its force, and she shivered. But it wasn't the cold that made her skin crawl. It was the feeling that something was waiting. And, for the first time, Rachel wasn't sure it was just the wind. Rachel stood in the kitchen, her hands frozen mid-motion, the knife gently pressing into the soft flesh of the tomato. She hadn't realized she had stopped chopping until she felt the heat of the knife handle in her palm, a strange warmth cutting through the numbness she had become so accustomed to. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the sound of the wind outside seemed to drift through the cracks in the old farmhouse, filling the silence with an eerie hum. She hadn't heard Paul in the house for a while now, and she knew it was time for her to check in on him. But instead, her eyes wandered again to the window, out to the barn where she could just barely make out the familiar figure of Rusty. There he was, standing stock still, his thick fur moving in the light breeze, as he often did, watching, waiting. His eyes, those strange, unblinking eyes, seemed to peer straight through her, as if he knew things about her, things she had never said aloud. She shook her head, forcing herself to look away. It wasn't like her to dwell on such thoughts. But there was something unsettling in the way Rusty watched her, in the way he lingered around the barn, always so far away, yet somehow so present. And yet, it wasn't just his silence that unnerved her. It was the way he seemed to understand her, his presence always so close when she needed it, as though he could sense the stirrings of the unrest that had quietly taken root in her heart over the years. Rachel knew she had been restless, knew that something within her had begun to shift. Life on the farm had started to feel repetitive, suffocating. It was a cycle she had fallen into without even realizing it, a never-ending loop of work, chores, quiet dinners, and even quieter nights. The world outside the farm seemed far away, a place she had left behind with the promises of a life that had never quite lived up to its expectations. Every day, it seemed like the distance between her and the world grew wider. And between her and Paul, too. There were moments when she felt a strange longing in her chest, a yearning for something more, something beyond the confines of the farm and the predictable rhythm of her days. At times, it felt like she had been waiting for something to break, some catalyst that would shatter the monotony and thrust her into the life she had always imagined. But nothing ever changed. Nothing ever seemed to break the surface. James, or Paul as he preferred to be called, had been her anchor, the man she had once fallen in love with, but somewhere along the way, the love had begun to fray at the edges. Their marriage, once filled with excitement and passion, had slowly been worn down by the years, by the quiet, unseen pressures of daily life. They had fallen into a routine, and for Rachel, that routine had started to feel like a cage. She had tried to talk to Paul about it, to tell him how she felt, but the words never came out the way she wanted them to. It was always in fleeting moments, when they were busy with farm work, or when the silence stretched too long between them. She would catch glimpses of the man she had married, but then the weight of the years, the routine, would close in again. She often wondered if he even noticed her growing restlessness, the way she had become distant at times, her mind drifting off to places she couldn't fully name. Sometimes, Rachel found herself staring into the distance, lost in thoughts she didn't know how to express. She had once believed in the simplicity of life, the quiet pleasures of the farm. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more out there waiting for her. Something that wasn't tied to the land, to the farm, or to the small, predictable world that had grown so confining. It was in those moments, when the longing grew sharp enough to hurt, that she would look out at the barn and find Rusty standing there, watching her. The way he stood, still as stone, as if waiting for something, waiting for her, perhaps. And somehow, in the presence of that strange creature, she felt a sense of calm, like he understood her in a way no one else did. She often wondered if Rusty could sense the unrest that churned within her. He had been there since they first moved in, and though she had never acknowledged it aloud, she had grown attached to him. He was no ordinary pet. There was something almost unnerving in the way he seemed to track her emotions, as if he could read her thoughts, could feel the tension that tightened her chest when the loneliness crept in. Rusty wasn't like the other animals on the farm. He had always kept his distance, neither friendly nor aggressive, but there was a quiet intelligence in his eyes, an awareness that unsettled Rachel in ways she didn't fully understand. And sometimes, when she stood in the kitchen or wandered the yard, she would catch him watching her, his gaze fixed with such intensity that it felt as though he were peering into the depths of her soul. It was a strange bond they shared, one that had begun to unsettle her as much as it comforted her. There were nights when, lying in bed, she would hear the soft rustle of movement outside her window and know, without looking, that Rusty was out there, just beyond the dark edge of the barn. She didn't need to see him to know he was there. It was as though their connection ran deeper than the physical world. Rachel didn't want to admit it, but she couldn't ignore the fact that, in those quiet moments of solitude, when Paul's snores filled the silence of their bedroom, it was Rusty's presence that seemed to calm her restless heart. There was something about the way he stood out there, watching the house, that made her feel less alone in her own skin. But at the same time, it made her wonder, what did he know? What was he waiting for? The thought gnawed at her, but she buried it deep down. It was probably nothing. Just her imagination running wild in the quiet of the night. She couldn't afford to dwell on it. After all, there was work to be done, a life to be lived, and a husband who still loved her in his quiet, steady way. But there were times, when the wind howled through the trees and the night stretched out endlessly before her, that Rachel found herself wishing for something else. Something more than the life she had settled into. And somewhere, in the deep recesses of her mind, she wondered if Rusty was the only one who truly understood. Rachel had always loved the barn. It had a strange, quiet charm about it, hidden away from the house, tucked just beyond the line of tall, wind-blown grasses. The faint scent of hay and old wood seemed to hang in the air, mixing with the earthy smell of the fields that stretched endlessly around her. But lately, something about the barn had begun to feel different. A strange pull had taken hold of her, a pull that called her to the barn, night after night, drawing her away from the house with an almost magnetic force. She had no real reason to go. The chores were done, the animals tended to. But still, she found herself walking there in the deepening twilight, the path beneath her feet soft and dark with the fall of evening. Sometimes, she would stand there at the entrance for moments, just staring into the dimness within. The quiet hum of the night seemed to get louder in those moments, a sound that filled her ears and made her heart beat faster. It was on these nights, when the world around her was hushed, that Rachel felt something she couldn't explain. It was as though the barn itself was waiting for her, like an old friend who had been left in the shadows, patiently waiting for her return. She could never quite shake the feeling that someone, or something, was always there, watching her, from the dark corners of the barn. At first, she tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just her imagination. But the pull had only grown stronger with each visit. James had started noticing the odd behavior. He was a man of habit, grounded in the rhythm of farm life, but lately, even he had begun to see things that didn't quite add up. He had seen the lights on in the barn long after dusk had settled. Sometimes, when he would head out to the porch in the dead of night for a drink of water or to check on the livestock, he would catch a glimpse of her, standing there, half hidden in the shadows of the barn. His eyes would narrow, a frown curling at the edge of his lips. She never seemed to notice him watching from the house, her gaze fixed on something he couldn't see. It bothered him. Something about it gnawed at him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Rachel had always been steadfast, reliable, the heart of their small home, and now, suddenly, she was slipping away. At first, it was just the late hours. Then, the noises started. He couldn't exactly explain what he was hearing, but there were moments when the silence of the night would be interrupted by faint, unsettling sounds coming from the barn, scratching noises, low thuds, or the sharp scrape of something dragging against the floor. James tried to dismiss them. After all, it was a barn. The wind, the animals, there were all sorts of reasons for odd sounds. But deep down, he knew that this was different. These sounds had a rhythm, a pattern, and they were growing more frequent. One evening, after hearing another strange scraping sound echo from the barn, James decided to investigate. The night was unusually still, the kind of night where the air felt thick, where the usual sounds of the farm, the rustle of the animals, the distant hum of insects, seemed muted. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Rachel, and made his way toward the barn. As he approached, his eyes caught the faint gleam of light flickering from behind the barn's old, weathered door. He hesitated, his brow furrowing. The barn door was ajar, just a sliver, and he could see the light from inside spilling out, casting long shadows across the ground. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening. The scraping sounds had stopped. The barn was still. But the unease that had been growing in him remained, like a heavy weight on his chest. He knew Rachel had been spending more time in there recently, but he never asked why. Perhaps it was the farm, the endless chores, the solitude that had driven her to retreat there in the evenings. But something felt off. Rachel's footsteps echoed softly behind him. She had slipped past him unnoticed, as if she had known he would be here. She stood a few feet away, her face unreadable in the dim light. "James, it's nothing," she said quietly, her voice distant, but he could hear the edge in it. The defensiveness was clear, though she wasn't looking at him. I just like the quiet, that's all. I like to think." He could tell that something had shifted. There was a distance in her voice, something unfamiliar in the way she spoke to him. It wasn't like Rachel. She had never been a woman to hide things. She had never been one to retreat into secrets. And yet, standing in the doorway of the barn, he could feel the distance between them growing. The gap was widening, and for the first time, James wasn't sure how to bridge it. "I didn't mean to worry you," Rachel continued, her words now softer, almost as though she were speaking more to herself than to him. I don't know why. It's like something's calling me here. James stood motionless for a moment, his eyes scanning her face, searching for something, anything, that would explain this shift in her. The words she had just spoken hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. He wanted to ask her more, to press her on why she had been acting so distant, so strange. But as he looked at her, his concern deepened, and something darker seemed to curl in the pit of his stomach. The next night, the strange sounds returned, and this time, they were louder, closer. James couldn't ignore them any longer. The barn, always a place of comfort, had begun to feel like a prison, and Rachel was locked inside, whether she realized it or not. His suspicion gnawed at him, a constant presence at the back of his mind. Something was happening, something he couldn't understand, but he could feel it. Rachel, for her part, couldn't explain what was drawing her to the barn. She had never been one to entertain strange thoughts, but the pull had become undeniable. The barn had become a refuge of sorts, a place where the rest of the world seemed distant, muted by the heavy air that surrounded it. But the guilt lingered just beneath the surface, a constant companion. She knew James was watching her, knew that the cracks in their relationship were beginning to show. But the deeper she went into the barn, the more she felt something, an unfamiliar presence, a weight pressing against her chest, urging her to stay. Something, or someone, was calling her, and she couldn't resist the pull any longer. The barn door creaked open again, and the scratching noise came once more, softer now, but still there. Rachel stepped into the darkness, as James watched from the shadows, unable to tear his eyes away. Something had shifted between them, and whatever it was, neither of them could walk away from it. Rachel's late-night visits to the barn had become more frequent, more ritualistic. Each night, after James had fallen asleep, she would slip out quietly, careful not to wake him. The stillness of the house would envelope her, the silence so thick that even her own breath seemed too loud. She would walk out into the night, guided only by the faint light of the moon, casting long, dark shadows across the path to the barn. Her footsteps, soft and deliberate, seemed to match the rhythm of her pulse, as though the very ground beneath her was attuned to her every movement. When she reached the barn, it felt like crossing into another world, a world where she could leave behind the weight of her responsibilities, her anxieties, her frustrations. Inside, it was always dark, the air thick with dust and the scent of hay. But it was the warmth of Rusty, the kangaroo, that made it bearable. Over the years, Rusty had been more than just a pet. He had been a constant presence, quiet and observant, his large eyes always following her movements, his ears twitching as though he understood every word she said. Lately, though, something had shifted. The way Rusty watched her, no longer just a companion, but something more. It was almost as if he could sense the turmoil inside her, the restlessness she could no longer ignore. When Rachel would sit on the old wooden crate in the corner of the barn, Rusty would come to her, lingering close, his head cocked slightly to the side as if waiting for her to speak. And sometimes, Rachel would talk, speaking aloud the thoughts she could never say to James, the thoughts she buried deep within herself. She had never been one to confide in anyone, but here, in the quiet darkness of the barn, she found herself opening up to the silent, steady presence of Rusty. The more time she spent with him, the more she felt the lines between reality and something else blur. Sometimes, when she would run her fingers through the soft fur on his back, she would feel a strange jolt of connection, as if she was no longer just touching a kangaroo, but something far older, something far deeper. Rusty would nuzzle into her hand, pressing his face against her palm, and she would think, almost as though she were speaking to him, that he understood her, understood things she couldn't put into words. There were moments when she would look into his eyes, and for the briefest instant, it was as though he was looking into her soul, as though he knew exactly what she was thinking. And it terrified her. But at the same time, it was a relief, a strange comfort she hadn't known she was missing. One night, James woke to find her gone again. He had grown used to the quiet, to the empty space beside him, but tonight something felt different. His mind, sharp and alert in the stillness of the house, began to wonder where Rachel had gone. He had grown accustomed to her late-night escapes, but tonight, the unease in his chest seemed to grow heavier. The hours passed, and Rachel didn't return. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong. He got out of bed, dressed quickly, and moved through the darkened house, careful not to make a sound. The floorboards creaked under his weight, but the rest of the house remained silent. As he reached the back door, he paused. He could see the faint glow of the barn in the distance, the door slightly ajar, as it had been so many times before. It was too late, and Rachel was still there. He made his way to the barn, the cool night air brushing against his skin, his thoughts clouded with suspicion and concern. As he approached, the familiar sounds of the barn seemed strangely absent. No rustling of the animals, no squeaking of old wood, only the faint, rhythmic thudding of his own heart. He stepped closer, his breath shallow, his eyes scanning the dark shape of the barn. When he pushed open the door, he wasn't prepared for what he saw. There, in the corner of the barn, was Rachel, sitting on the crate, her fingers tangled in Rusty's fur, her face distant, almost blank. But it wasn't just her demeanor that caught James's attention. Rusty, his once docile, familiar pet, was standing unusually still. His ears were pressed flat against his head, his body tense, and his eyes, those eyes were locked on James with an intensity that sent a chill running down his spine. It wasn't the curious gaze of a pet anymore. It was something else entirely. Something cold. Something almost hostile. "Rachel," James said, his voice low, unsure of how to break the tension in the room. "What are you doing out here? It's past midnight." Rachel turned slowly, her gaze flicking toward him, and for the first time in a long time, James saw something unfamiliar in her eyes, a strange emptiness, as though she were somewhere far away, unreachable. She stood up, brushing off the hay from her pants, but Rusty didn't move. He remained planted at her side, his eyes never leaving James. There was a moment of silence, as if the barn itself had held its breath. I'm just thinking," Rachel replied softly, her voice distant. "It's peaceful here." James didn't respond immediately. He could feel the tension between them, thick and uncomfortable. There was something about Rachel's voice that felt off, as though she were lying. But he couldn't place why. He looked at Rusty again, trying to shake off the strange feeling creeping along his spine. "That's all?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "Just thinking?" Before Rachel could answer, Rusty suddenly moved. He stepped forward, placing himself between Rachel and James, his posture rigid, his mouth slightly open as though preparing to snarl. It was the first time James had seen him act like this, aggressive, territorial. The air grew thick with a strange tension, as though the barn itself had come alive with something darker, something that had shifted in the very bones of the place. James froze, his eyes locked on the kangaroo. The world around him felt still, as though time had paused. Rusty's eyes were dark and unblinking, fixed on James with a coldness that made his blood run cold. Rachel stood motionless, as though she were waiting for something to happen, her hands now hanging loosely at her sides. "Rusty," James murmured, taking a tentative step forward. But the kangaroo didn't move. His body tensed, and James's breath caught in his throat as he took another step. Rusty's eyes narrowed, and he let out a low growl, a sound so unlike him that James's heart skipped a beat. Rachel didn't seem to notice the change. She only stood there, her gaze distant, as though she were lost in her own thoughts. But then, in the dim light of the barn, it hit her, Rusty wasn't just protecting her. He was acting like he knew something, something she had never told him. It was as though he understood her better than she understood herself. The weight of that realization settled heavily on her chest. She had felt it before, in the quiet moments when she was alone with Rusty, the way he seemed to be attuned to her, the way he watched her with an unsettling focus. Now, as she stood there in the barn, with the coldness of Rusty's gaze burning into her, she could no longer deny it. Rusty knew something. And whatever it was enough to make him act in ways she could never have imagined. It was the quiet that first unsettled James. It was the same kind of quiet that had greeted him on countless nights, but tonight it felt different. He had grown used to Rachel's nightly routines, the way she slipped into the shadows of the barn, away from his gaze. But tonight, something about her absence gnawed at him. The house, normally filled with the steady hum of the television or the rustle of papers as Rachel worked, was too still. The air felt thick, weighted, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Rachel had been gone longer than usual, and for the first time in ages, James felt that familiar tug of suspicion creeping up his spine. He had brushed it off before, the way she'd started retreating more and more into the barn, the late-night wanderings. He told himself it was just her way of coping with the mundane grind of farm life, but tonight, something felt off. The ticking of the clock in the hallway, the way the house seemed almost too empty, it all worked together to draw his attention to the barn in a way he hadn't felt before. His feet moved almost on their own, drawn by an invisible thread. He found himself standing by the back door, his hand on the cool metal of the handle. Outside, the darkness pressed in, the field stretched out before him like an endless void. The barn sat ahead, barely visible in the darkness, its silhouette a shadow against the darkened sky. But there, in the stillness, James could see something else. A faint flicker of light, his eyes narrowed as he recognized the glow that came from the barn's window. He had seen it before, but tonight it felt different. The light was stronger, more deliberate. Rachel was in there. As he moved closer, the night air seemed to cling to him, heavy and thick. He reached the door, and for a moment, he hesitated. The barn door, which had always creaked with the wind, was now quiet. The sounds of the animals were absent, and even the usual rustling of hay in the corners was gone. Only the distant hum of insects, the occasional croak of a frog in the fields, broke the silence. James pushed open the door, the wood moaning under his weight. He stepped inside, eyes adjusting to the low light. The barn was eerily still. It was empty, save for a few scattered tools and the soft, familiar shape of the crates against the far wall. But something wasn't right. He heard it then, soft, almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. A voice. Rachel's voice. He stood frozen in place, his breath caught in his throat. It was faint, almost as if she were whispering, but it was unmistakably her. He couldn't make out the words, just the low, soothing cadence of her voice. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise. What was she doing out here, talking like that? The sound seemed to come from deeper in the barn, from behind the stack of hay bales where the shadows were thickest. James took a step forward, his feet crunching on the gravel beneath him. But as he moved closer, the voice stopped. The silence returned. He scanned the dark corners of the barn, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was no sign of Rachel. No sign of anyone at all. Just the empty shadows stretching out before him, silent and unmoving. Rachel? His voice was barely a whisper as he called out, but it seemed to echo through the barn, bouncing off the walls. There was no answer. Only the steady sound of his own breathing. And then, a soft shuffle of movement behind him. James spun around, his breath caught in his throat. There, just beyond the dim glow of the barn light, stood Rachel. Her figure, half hidden in the shadows, seemed almost otherworldly. Her eyes were wide, her face drawn, as if she had been caught in some private moment she didn't want to share. She was silent, her gaze locked on him, but there was something in her eyes that stopped him in his tracks. Something he couldn't quite place, something unsettling, something distant. "What are you doing out here, Rachel?" James asked, his voice shaky now, his suspicions growing. He could feel the tension building in the air, a heaviness that pressed against his chest, making it harder to breathe. Rachel didn't immediately respond. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes shifting briefly to the side, toward the far end of the barn where Rusty's stall was. James followed her gaze, but there was nothing there, not at first. But then, just as his gaze returned to Rachel, he saw it, Rusty, standing at the edge of the shadows, his eyes reflecting the faint light in a way that made James's stomach twist. The kangaroo was staring directly at him. Not in the casual, docile way he had grown used to, but with an intensity that unsettled him. His fur was ruffled, his posture rigid. He was watching them both, but it wasn't the innocent curiosity James had known. No, this was something more. Something primal. Rusty didn't take his eyes off James as if daring him to move. "Rachel," James said again, his voice harder this time, the fear in his chest beginning to rise. "What's going on here? What are you doing with him?" For a long moment, Rachel didn't say anything. She stood still, her gaze flickering between him and Rusty, as if weighing something in her mind. And then, without warning, something shifted in her expression. It was as if the mask she had been holding in place suddenly cracked. Her face, which had been so guarded, now betrayed a flicker of guilt, and something else, something darker that she couldn't quite suppress. "I'm just..." She stopped herself, as though unsure of how to explain. Her voice came out soft, almost hesitant. "I'm just talking to him. I don't know, James. I don't know why." Her words hung in the air, fragile, uncertain. And yet, there was something in her tone that made James's pulse quicken. It wasn't guilt alone. There was something else beneath it, something he couldn't name but that made him feel, deep down, that he wasn't getting the full story. But before he could press her further, Rusty stepped forward. Slowly, almost purposefully, the kangaroo moved closer to Rachel, his eyes never leaving James. The air seemed to grow colder as he closed the distance between them, his movements deliberate, measured. James instinctively took a step back, his mind racing. What was happening here? Why was Rachel so drawn to this animal, and why was Rusty acting this way? Rachel looked at him, and in that brief glance, James could see the conflict warring within her. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words never came. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly, as if overwhelmed by something too difficult to put into words. When she spoke again, her voice was low, strained, and something in her tone made James's heart race. "I can't explain it, James," she whispered. "I don't even understand it myself." She turned slightly, her hand brushing against Rusty's fur, the connection between them momentarily unbroken. James felt the knot in his stomach tighten as he watched the two of them, Rachel, so lost in the moment, and Rusty, who seemed to understand something she could never explain. "Rachel," James began, his voice thick with emotion. But his words faltered when he saw her expression harden, a brief flash of defiance flashing in her eyes. "I'm not asking for your approval," she snapped. I'm just trying to make sense of things." The words hung between them, heavy and laden with tension. Rachel's face softened again, her defiance fading into something more vulnerable, as if she was torn between the urge to break free and the need to stay grounded in something she couldn't quite grasp. But just as quickly, her gaze flickered back to Rusty, and it was as if something inside her hardened, the pull between them growing stronger. Tea was late when James decided to take matters into his own hands. The night had already settled over the farm, the usual stillness wrapping itself around him like a thick blanket. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, muffling even the faintest sounds, the rustling of leaves, the occasional croak of a frog in the distance, the soft murmur of the wind. It was the perfect cover for what he was about to do. His heart raced with a mix of anger and confusion. For days, he had watched Rachel's increasingly erratic behavior, her late-night excursions to the barn, her strange connection with that kangaroo. But tonight, something inside him snapped. He couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't let her slip further into whatever this was. The flashlight in his hand felt cold and heavy, its beam cutting through the darkness as he crept toward the barn. He had hoped, at first, that this was all some figment of his imagination, that Rachel was just overworked, maybe a little too tired from the demands of their life on the farm. But there was no denying the changes. There was no pretending anymore. Tonight, he was going to find out the truth. His boots crunched lightly on the gravel, the sound deafening in the silence. Each step took him closer to the barn, where the faintest glow of light shone through the cracks in the weathered wood. Rachel had to be there. He knew it. He had to be sure. James reached the barn door, pressing his ear against the rough wood. Inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. He hesitated, his fingers brushing the cool metal of the handle. A chill ran down his spine, and for a brief moment, he thought about turning back. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when everything inside him screamed that something wasn't right. He slowly pushed the door open, the hinges creaking slightly as he stepped into the barn. The faint light illuminated the dusty corners, the forgotten tools, the empty space that usually felt comforting. But tonight, it felt foreign. Cold. The barn was empty, or so it seemed. Then, he heard it. The soft murmur of voices, low, indistinct, but unmistakably Rachel's. It stopped him in his tracks. His heart skipped a beat, and his breath caught in his chest. She was here, just beyond the light, talking to someone, but who? He moved quietly, the beam of the flashlight dancing across the floor as he crept deeper into the barn, the shadows stretching out in front of him. As he turned the corner, he froze. There, in the farthest corner, Rachel stood, her back to him, her voice soft and soothing as she spoke to Rusty. Her words were inaudible from where James stood, but there was something in her tone, something too gentle, too intimate, that sent a wave of unease crashing over him. His pulse quickened as he watched her. She seemed so lost in the moment, so absorbed in the quiet exchange between her and the kangaroo. James felt his stomach tighten. He had never seen her like this before. There was an unspoken connection between them, something that went beyond the strange bond they had always shared with Rusty. No, this was something deeper. This was something wrong. And then, as if sensing his presence, Rachel froze. Her body went rigid, her head snapping to the side as her eyes widened in shock. James had barely enough time to react before it happened. She turned toward him with a frantic energy, as if she had been caught doing something she couldn't explain. "James!" Her voice was sharp, tinged with panic, and she took a step toward him, her hands held out in an attempt to stop him. "What are you doing here? What are you doing?" The fear in her voice didn't match the cool, composed demeanor she had always carried. This was different. This was raw, unguarded. But there was something else too, something darker, hidden beneath her words. It was as if she had been caught in a lie too big to contain, and she wasn't sure how to undo the damage. But before James could say anything, before he could question her or demand answers, he heard it. A soft shuffle of movement, Rusty. The kangaroo was moving. Not casually, not in the usual, placid way he had seen him move around the farm. No, this was different. Rusty's steps were deliberate, predatory. He seemed to glide from the shadows, his gaze fixed solely on James. The flashlight trembled in James's hand, his breath coming in quick gasps. He didn't know what was happening, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on him. The kangaroo moved closer, each step deliberate and purposeful. James took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to get away, to turn and run. But it was too late. Rusty lunged. The movement was too fast, too precise. James barely had time to react as the kangaroo's claws scraped across his chest, knocking the flashlight from his hand and sending it skittering across the floor. Pain flared across his ribs, a sharp, searing heat that left him gasping for breath. He stumbled backward, his hands reaching for something, anything, to steady himself. The barn seemed to close in on him. He fought back, trying to shove Rusty away, to regain control, but the kangaroo was relentless. Its eyes, those strange, unnervingly human-like eyes, locked onto his. There was something in them, something he couldn't explain. A knowledge. A hunger. The animal's aggression felt too calculated, too intelligent for something that should have been driven by instinct. Rachel's voice rang out in the chaos, a sharp command that cut through the confusion. "Rusty, stop. Stop." Her voice was pleading now, almost desperate. But Rusty didn't stop. Instead, he drew closer, his body taut with energy, ready to strike again. James, disoriented and in pain, pushed the kangaroo off of him, using every ounce of strength he had left. He staggered to his feet, his hands shaking, his heart racing. But before he could catch his breath, he saw her. Rachel. She was standing just out of reach, her expression unreadable. For a moment, her gaze flickered between him and the kangaroo, and then, without warning, she stepped forward. Her hands were raised, her voice calm, but her actions were anything but. She wasn't trying to calm James down. She wasn't trying to help him. No, she was helping Rusty. "Rachel, no!" James shouted, his voice hoarse, panicked. But it was too late. With a fluid motion, Rachel moved to Rusty's side, gently guiding the kangaroo back toward the shadows. She didn't look at James, not even once. Her focus was entirely on Rusty, as if everything she had been, everything she had ever known, was wrapped up in that strange, unsettling bond. And with that, James knew. It wasn't just the animal that had changed. Rachel had too. As the kangaroo disappeared into the shadows, James was left standing in the dim light of the barn, breathless and alone. The pain in his chest throbbed, but it was nothing compared to the sickening realization that crawled under his skin. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. And it wasn't just Rusty. It was Rachel. It had always been Rachel. Sometimes, the strangest relationships can blur the line between loyalty and obsession. But what happens when an innocent bond turns into something darker? What would you do if your partner's secrets turned out to be as wild as a bond that defies logic? Would you confront them, or would you run? If you found this story intriguing, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content that dives deep into the mysterious and the unsettling. Stay tuned for what comes next.